Well, honestly, a service department is probably one of the simplest things in a dealership there is to operate because again, we decide what we're going to charge for labor. We decide how much we're going to charge the customer for labor on the job, and we buy parts from ourselves, right? And then our cost of goods sold in the service department is just really our technicians for the most part. So from a simplistic standpoint, in terms of a business standpoint, it's relatively simple. What makes it complex is that most of my dealers don't understand what they're actually selling.
Yeah. And I think that's the piece of this is so we have to understand what our inventory is and how we deal with it. And that's the first mistake that we often see is that dealers are not keeping track of their inventory in the service department, or managers are not keeping track of their inventory. And when we look at inventory in the service department, our inventory is what, Bob?
Time. We buy time.
We buy time. And how do we do this?
We buy time by the hour. So when you have a technician there, he's there for 8 hours. We have 8 hours of time we have purchased for that one technician that day. We track it by the 10th of an hour. So every 6 minutes, I need to know what's going on with that technician. What are they doing with that time? And then when we bill the time out, we bill it either by the half hour or the hour. So we buy it by the hour, track it by the 10th, and then we rebill it out either by half hour or hour increments.
Right. And so when we have this mentality that time is our inventory, it changes everything. Because when we start working with dealers to understand what amount of time lost that they have in the service department, typically it's one of those things that makes you kind of take a step back. And I always ask the question, let's say that you're losing 2 or 3 hours a day in your service department per technician, which is not out of the realm of many service departments when we start working with them. So let's say that we're losing 20% of our inventory every day because it just happens. It just happens. The technician has to go look for a unit. And it probably happens at yours too, all right? And it also correlates with the smoke break, or a customer calls in and they need all the technical advice for free, which is a whole different liability issue. We'll get into it a different time. Or any of these things. So it just happens where we lose time over and over. But if you were to lose 20% of your whole goods, you were to walk in your dealership tomorrow and 20% of your whole goods vanished, what would your reaction be? Like, would it be like, well, Sarah, happens sometimes? No, you would be like, what happened? We were robbed. Call the police, put a police report together. Somebody, we need vengeance here. Like, okay, maybe that's a little extreme.
That's extreme.
But this is what happens. But in service, we're like, well, just happens sometimes. Like, it's insane. All right, so I'm going to have you do a little exercise with me. If you've been following us for a number of years, you probably have done it, but this is a good exercise to refresh and understand what kind of money you're walking over by losing just 1 hour a day in your service department. So I need you to get a piece of paper out, a pen, and your calculator on your phone, because despite what Mrs. Smith said in 6th grade, you do have your calculator wherever you go.
Wherever you go.
Take that, Mrs. Smith. Okay. So the first thing I need you to do on your piece of paper is write down your labor rate. What is your labor rate? This can be your posted labor rate. We'll get into internal versus external and all the other things later, but just your posted labor rate. What's your posted labor rate? And then I need you to write down the number of technicians in your service department. That's where we're going to start. Now, what we want to know is, what does it cost us to lose 1 hour a day per technician in your service department? So what I'm going to have you do first is I want you to take your labor rate and multiply it by 5. So I'm going to use the example of Sarah's magical dealership. I'm still workshopping the name, but right now that feels good.
It's a bad name.
All right. So in my magical dealership,
it makes me think you sell something other than equipment.
All right. In my dealership, my labor rate is $100 an hour, and I have 3 technicians because I need easy math. So I'm going to take my $100 labor rate and I'm going to multiply it by 5. Okay. So my labor rate times 5, that will give me $500. So if I lost 1 hour a day for 1 week, it would cost me $500 for 1 technician. All right, do that math. Then we are going to take that number, $500, and I'm going to multiply it by 4. Because in my magical world, we got 4 weeks a month. We're not going to get into 4.325. Again, too much complex math. So I'm going to take my $500 and multiply it by 4. That's going to give me $2,000. Now I'm going to take my $2,000 and multiply it by 11. 11 is the number of months that we can on average keep a technician busy in a service department. This accounts for all the training you need to send your technicians to, the PTO, the sick days, all of these other unbilled times inside of your service department. So on average, 11 months out of the year is what we can do to keep our technicians busy. So I'm going to take my $2,000 and multiply it by 11. That's going to give me $22,000. But wait, there's more. All right, I said, how many technicians do I have? I have 3 in my service department. So I'm going to take my $22,000 and multiply it by 3, giving me $66,000 by simply losing 1 hour a day per technician. And the real question is, how easy is it to lose 1 hour a day?
You can lose 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 6 minutes there, needed the smoke break on my cell phone. You can lose an hour without thinking about
Before you know it. So I want to know, what's your number? What is losing 1 hour a day costing you in your service department? Put that in the chat for me. You know, I was at a meeting with a number of construction dealers about a year ago, and we went through this example, and I had one person, he managed about 400 field technicians, so they were out doing mobile service for construction equipment. He came up to me afterwards, and Sarah said, Sarah, I feel like I needed to go puke after you did that, which is really one of my favorite things people say after I speak. And he said, Sarah, I'm losing $13 million a year by losing 1 hour a day, and I'm losing way more than 1 hour a day. All right, friends, that is how this continues to move. So we got 539,000 from Brittany, 255 from Jen, 101 from Christy. We've got these numbers coming in. I mean, Jen, $255,000 isn't that much, is it? No, it is. Okay. All right. So we have to talk about inventory, though. The moment we get away from the inventory conversation is the moment that we have to come back to this place and say, we have to get this right. So this is mistake number 1. Now the question is, how do we fix it? So Bob, the first thing we have to do is focus on getting technicians to clock in and out of every single work order.
Exactly. And this is the mistake that I see. Again, what happens in a shop is that they say, well, our technicians are keeping track of time, or when they get the job done, they come up and they say, oh yeah, I think it took me about, I don't know, 2 hours. Then that's they started at 8 and then they stopped at noon. Okay. And I go like, oh, okay. And so what they do is they don't actually keep track of time. And this is not a technician's fault. Technicians are notoriously bad of, they lose track of time. They're working on a job, they're focused on what they're doing and things like this, and time just goes away. And so again, so they have to clock on. So when they come in the morning, our rule of thumb is the moment you come in, you clock on a work order, and you don't ever go off of a work order until you leave at night. So there's never a time during the day that we're not keeping track of what's going on with the technician. You've got to have them clock on and clock out. Now I have technicians say, well, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to clock in and clock out. And then my next question always is, well, how do you get paid? They go, well, what do you mean? I go, well, how do you get paid? And they go, well, I come in the morning, I clock in. And I said, and then what do you do? Well, I said, when I leave at night, I clock off. And I go, oh, so you're willing to do it for you. You're just not willing to do it for the company. I said, you're doing it now, and that's how you get paid. Our shop functions the same way. You get paid because you clock in and clock out every day. That's how our shop makes money. We have to have you clock in and clock out. And once they get doing it and they understand why we're doing it, and then we have bonuses that tie to that, it all starts to work.
It is. And so it is not, there's no exception to clocking in and out of work orders. It's the first thing you have to do if we want to reclaim this inventory and not have lost inventory. The next thing that you have to do if we want to fix the problem of the inventory issue is we have to make sure your labor rate is set correctly. Okay, we've got to make sure that this space of what we actually are charging for our inventory makes sense. Now, I don't know if for you've had any price increases for your whole goods units over the last, I don't know, few years. My guess is probably yes. But if I were to ask you if you've had any price increases for your labor, the answer would probably be 50-50, yes and no. You go, but Sarah, we can't change our labor rate. Our area is different. Yeah. You're right, you special little snowflake. No, your area is not different. Eggs, milk, and bread have continued to go up. Like Walmart and Target and all the grocery stores have not been like, you know what? this area is different. We better be careful on the pricing. No, they've gone up. Your whole goods have gone up. Your parts have gone up. But the one thing that you truly control of your labor rate is what you can set, and it needs to be adjusted accordingly, especially with inflation happening. So how do you set your labor rate? Well, there's a few things to keep in mind, but the way you don't set your labor rate is by picking up the phone, calling the dealership down the road and being like, yo, what's your labor rate, bro? Like, okay, that's not what we do. And I don't know, bro seems to work well, at least in my house. Okay, so what's your labor rate? Because you know what they're doing? They're calling the next dealership, who's calling the next dealership, who's calling the next one. And all of a sudden, y'all have all your labor rates going around in a circle. That's what we call cooling ignorance in Missouri. Okay, you're all just moving from one labor rate to the next to the next. The way that we need to set your labor rate is by calling the local Ford, Chevy, Honda dealer, any of these in your area, and asking the question in the auto space, what is your labor rate? You know, Ford spent about $20 million a few years ago to determine for each county what the labor rate is in order to get and retain an A-level technician. We're going to dive into that a little bit later, but that's what they said. They said, what does the labor rate need to be in each area of the United States, in every county of the United States, to get and retain A-level technicians? And they set the labor rates based on that. Now, if you have a quick extra 20 mil laying around, you're welcome to redo this study. Otherwise, I would just encourage you to call your local Ford dealer and ask what they did. Up to you. All right. But I'm curious to know from you guys, and go ahead and put this in the chat. What part of the country are you in, and what is your posted labor rate? I think this will be a really eye-opening thing. So when we look at this, though, I want you to be about 10% less than the local Ford dealership, depending on the industry that you're in. That's about the sweet spot that you need to be for most industries overall. Awesome. We've got some good ones coming at 150, 160. Awesome. Keep those coming. I think it's really good for everyone to see. But again, I'm going to challenge you to pick up the phone and call your local Ford dealership.
Yeah, it is. Like Sarah said, you know, what if you do is you just call everybody else around, you all end up basically in the same place. The other thing that we have, and I know we got a lot of our friends in Canada here too, a lot of our dealers, but again, we have to keep in mind that inflation right now in North America is about 25%. So if you haven't moved your labor rate up in the last 2 years more than 25%, even though you've got a labor rate that's where it was, you're actually losing 25% of all your value that you're doing it there. So you've got to get that labor rate up. And then the other thing I always encourage my dealers to do, and they say, well, gosh, Bob, if I raise my labor rate 20%, what if I lose some customers? And I say, well, you think you'd lose 20% of them? And they go, well, I wouldn't lose that many. I go, well, if you raised your labor rate up 20% and you lost 20% of your customers, you would have 20% less work that you're making 20% more on. Your shop already is way behind. I said, this isn't a bad deal. And the ones you're losing are the ones that are price sensitive anyway, right? So don't worry about it. I've never had a shop in the 40 years I've been doing this that's raised their labor rate and their shop had to close because they ran out of work. Never had it happen.
That's it. All right. The third thing that you can do in order to fix the problem or the first accounting mistake is evaluate your pricing strategies. So Bob, when we start talking about pricing strategies, what are the things we need to keep in mind from the accounting perspective with this?
Well, again, from a pricing strategy, you know, again, our shop has to be profitable. And from a percentage standpoint, we're going to talk about that a little bit. But from your pricing strategy, there's basically 3 ways to price out work in every shop that's out there. I don't care if it's in marine, RV, power sports, construction. There's 3 methods. One's called menu pricing. And menu pricing is what we use when we're doing our basic services, a 50-hour service, a 100-hour service, whatever it is. Here's the menu price. The menu pricing includes the cost of labor as well as the parts. So that's menu pricing, okay? And typically you're going to have your labor accelerated or a little bit more advanced than what it actually takes. So we're going to make some good money on our labor, and the parts are going to be what the parts are. The other way to do it is what we call time and material. And time and material is what most shops use, which is the worst way at all to price work out. It's the lazy man's way to do it. Okay, I'll just tell you this. So it's easier for a service manager, right? But it's the most unprofitable way to price to work out. And time and material is just exactly that. So let's say I'm a technician, and let's say that Sarah's my service manager. She puts me on this job. That's right.
Makes sense.
Well, that would make total sense. In our shop, that is a magical dealership. That's where I work at. So I'm a service tech in there, and she puts me on this job. And let's say that I'm splitting a tractor apart. For those of you in ag, and I'm going to put a clutch in and things like this. That's probably a 18-hour job on a 100 horsepower or under tractor. So I have 18 hours in this job, okay? And so Sarah's going to bill for the 18 hours plus the parts. That's called time and material. What happens many times is you have your best technician on those jobs, and instead of it taking 18 hours, they get it done in 16 hours, where an average technician would take 18 hours, but because you're using time and material billing, you're actually only billing for 16. So you actually took all of that money you spent on training for that technician, all the money that you've got invested in tools to make them faster so that you could charge the customer less. Doesn't make sense to me.
That makes sense.
So that's time and material. I will tell you, most shops, 80% of the shops, they use it as their primary method of pricing out jobs, and is the absolute worst way to do it. Then the other one is making sure they're doing like standard labor rates or flat rating, depends upon your industry. It's the same thing. And we're saying, hey, this job that I just said, we're going to put a clutch in your tractor. And this job, when I talk to the customer, it's $2,200 or $2,800. It's a flat rate for it. And I've calculated that using 20 hours of time. So if we run into a problem, we're not going to overcharge the customer, but the customer now is aware of this job is going to be $2,200 plus the parts for the labor, if that's what we're going to do with that. And that's what it's going to be. So when they purchase the job from me, give me approval to do it, they already know what it's going to cost to do the job. And customers love that. Now, if we get it done in 18 hours, we're still going to charge 20. If it takes us 21 hours, we're still going to charge 20. Okay, so again, but there's flat rating systems. We actually have a whole complete flat rating system in our what our dealers use to do that with. So most of our dealers again are going to come out well on it. But again, if we happen to go over, we don't charge the customer more, because there are times where we go over a little bit and there's times where we come under a little bit, and then it all averages out for us.
That's right. So when we think about looking at time as our inventory, and a mistake that's not what we look at it as, we have to be laser focused on our pricing strategy, because the moment we get our mind off of like, how do we price these effectively, we're not treating time like our inventory anymore. And so we've got to be laser focused on that.
Exactly.